Hello Cardinals, and welcome to our second lesson in distance learning. Today's lesson is on a different kind of war. This is not the same as Charming Billy because this is a non-fiction piece, but they are companion pieces. So let's get started. The first thing you want to do before you read a non-fiction piece is set a purpose for reading. Otherwise, a lot of the information can just be overwhelming. So, what I want you to do is think about why you're reading this. Obviously, you're reading it because, number one, Miss Millen and Miss De La Cruz assigned it, but also because it goes with the story, Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy? So, maybe you're reading this because you want to find out more about the Vietnam War. Maybe you're reading this because you looked at the title, A Different Kind of War, and you want to figure out how this was a different kind of war. So right now, go ahead and set a purpose. Why are you reading this? At the end, we're going to come back and see if you achieved your purpose. So, the seeds of the Vietnam War were planted in 1858 when France attacked Vietnam for control of the government. So, this war started sometime around the 50s, but it goes all the way back to a problem that started in 1858. After decades of frustration under foreign rule, many Vietnamese began supporting the communist movement against the French. Meanwhile, the United States struggled against the spread of communism worldwide. So what I want you to do right now is paraphrase lines 1 through 5. Keep in mind when you paraphrase, you usually restate any figurative language. In this case, the sentence that refers to the seeds of war, what does it mean that the seeds of war were planted in 1858? So you're just basically taking some of the fancier words in this and you're distilling them down to more plain language. So I want you to go ahead and do that right now. Rewrite this in your own words. You should be able to do it in 2-3 sentences at the most. Now we have this chart that shows what the USA was doing, or what was happening in the US and what was happening in Vietnam. So during the 1950s, this would have been during the time that we referred to as the Cold War, which was the US and many other countries going against communism. So in 1950, the United States sends economic aid to the French forces in Vietnam. Okay. In 1954, the French were defeated in Vietnam, and then Vietnam divided into communist North and non-communist South. That's important. In 1957, communist rebels, the Vietcong, fought for the control of South Vietnam. So, I'm not trying to tell you guys what my opinion is on war or anything like that. I'm trying to make it easier. So, if we're talking about this in terms of the US, the Vietcong are going to be considered the bad guys. Frankly, in US history, communists are always the bad guys. In America, in 1965, anti-war protests became widespread. One of the things is that because this was a fight between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, a lot of people believed that the US didn't have a right to interfere in what they were doing. In 1968, that's when US citizens began to think that this is a war that's never going to be won. In 1965 in Vietnam, the US bombed North Vietnam, the communists, the Vietcong, and it was the first US combat troops arrived in Vietnam. In 1968, when Americans are like, there's no way we can win this, the number of US troops in Vietnam had reached its peak. The North Vietnamese and the Vietcong launched a Tet Offensive, a series of surprise attacks. In 1970, 4 students are killed in an anti-war demonstration in Ohio. I am going to offer an extra enrichment opportunity involving this, which I will post on Google Classroom. In 1973, all the troops leave Vietnam, all the US troops. In 1975, South Vietnam surrenders to the communists. The US embassy in Vietnam is evacuated. In 1978, thousands of refugees flee Vietnam to escape poverty and punishment for aiding the United States during the war. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is dedicated in Washington, D.C., and in 1986, the Vietnamese government begins economic restructuring. One of the things about communism is it's not really good for the economy. And in 1995, the United States and Vietnam restore full diplomatic relations. To think that some things that started in the 1950s that we didn't resolve between the two nations until 1995, that's kind of interesting. A different kind of war. Every war presents unique difficulties and dangers. World War II had terrifying new weapons that caused mass destruction on a scale never seen before. I wonder what they're referring to when they say that World War II had a new weapon that was known for its mass destruction. Give you a hint. In the Korean War, soldiers fought in severe winters with heavy snows and sub-zero temperatures. But soldiers in the Vietnam War faced conditions that were completely different from the previous conflicts. So what this wants you to do is it wants you to paraphrase the article's introduction, break longer sentences into shorter ones when necessary, and remember to simplify the language as you restate it. So if we just look at this first sentence, that every war presents unique difficulties and dangers, what is that actually saying to you? It's saying that every war is different, but they're all dangerous. It's saying that every war is hard, but they're hard in different ways. So make sure that when you're doing this, you're putting it into your own words. If you would never use the words sub-zero temperatures, then change that. What is a sub-zero temperature? Well, I said temperature below zero, but you know what I'm saying, okay? So that's what you're going to do here. Guerrilla warfare. I know it sounds like guerrilla, but it is not the same thing. The United States went to Vietnam to prevent the communist country of North Vietnam from taking over South Vietnam, which had a non-communist government. But many South Vietnamese wanted communist rule. The South Vietnamese who helped the North Vietnamese fight the Americans were known as the Vietcong. Unlike World War II, the war in Vietnam had no front lines or clearly defined places where fighting took place. The Vietcong knew they could not beat the U.S. military in traditional battle, so they used guerrilla warfare, which is surprise attacks by a small band of fighters. Their knowledge of the terrain, so their knowledge of the area surrounding and what the jungles and stuff like that, allowed them to move through the jungle undetected. They constructed networks of tunnels in which they could hide or even live for extended periods. To the Americans, it seemed like the Viet Cong were everywhere and nowhere all at once. A group of fighters would suddenly appear and mount a surprise attack and then disappear. Some Viet Cong also hid in plain sight among villagers in the Vietnamese countryside. By day, the fighters were farmers. By night, they helped the Viet Cong. American soldiers felt that they never knew who they could truly trust among the Vietnamese. So now you're going to draw some conclusions. How did guerrilla warfare affect American troops? Did it force the U.S. troops to deal with constant possibility of attack? Did it allow the Viet Cong to win traditional battles at the front lines? Underline clues that help you support that. We kind of already did that. Booby-traps. I know that's a funny word, booby-traps. Just as deadly as Viet Cong fighters were the explosive devices they left behind. The U.S. Army estimates that as many as 1/3 of U.S. casualties in Vietnam were caused by landmines and booby-traps. That's a lot. For example, the Viet Cong noticed that American soldiers were in the habit of kicking empty soda cans lying on the ground. We all kind of have that desire, huh? So the Viet Cong placed explosive devices inside empty cans and left them where the U.S. troops would find them. The knowledge that any innocent appearing object could hide a trap was a constant worry for soldiers. Fallen leaves might conceal a pit full of sharpened bamboo called punji sticks. We learned this from most dangerous game. A vine in the jungle might hold a tripwire connected to a grenade or a landmine. So over here, it asks you, what effect do you think the constant worry described in this section would eventually have on a soldier? If you had to live constantly in fear of kicking the wrong can or stepping on the wrong pile of leaves, what would that do to you as a soldier? Land and climate of Vietnam. Soldiers that also battled the land and climate of Vietnam. What does climate mean? Yeah, weather. So, the Vietnamese countryside contained both thick jungles and farmland. The jungle provided cover for the Vietcong in their ambushes and booby-traps. Rice, the main crop of Vietnam, was grown in flooded fields called rice paddies. After wading through rice paddies, soldiers had to pick off leeches that covered their legs. Poisonous snakes could also lurk in the waters. Southern Vietnam had rainy winters and hot, humid summers. Soldiers endured extreme heat and constant damp. Even small wounds could quickly become infected in the tropical climate. This is a picture of a rice paddy. It's kind of hard to see because the workbook isn't the greatest of pictures, but it's a flooded field where the rice grows. Okay? Some other things that they had to fight are morale. Physical dangers were not the only challenges that soldiers faced in Vietnam. Morale refers to the mental or emotional state of a group. When morale is good, members in a group are generally confident and disciplined. So right now, a lot of us are kind of feeling that our morale is low. Our emotional state is low. We miss being able to see our friends. We miss sitting in a classroom bored, right? We kind of miss those everyday things. So you kind of want to think about what's going on with our morale. This question wants you to underline the definition given for the word morale, which we did, and they want you to use your knowledge of the word to write a sentence describing why the soldiers in Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy suffered from low morale. What did they have to go through in the story that changed their mental state, their emotional state? What made them afraid or stressed? So stress. Soldiers were affected by constant stress. The military created heavily fortified bases and rest and relaxation areas where soldiers could let down their guard for a time, but outside these safe places, troops never knew where or when the next threat would arise. There was also the draft. In the 1960s and 70s, many soldiers were drafted into the military. That means that they were required to serve by the government. They did not have a choice. In contrast, today's U.S. military is an all-volunteer force. Not all who served believed that the United States was doing the right thing in Vietnam. Remember, there were those protests. Some were angry at being forced to risk their lives for a cause that they didn't believe in. Can you imagine having to go out and almost die for something that you don't agree with? And the home front. Soldiers were also aware that the American public was deeply divided on Vietnam. Knowing that many Americans did not support them also took a toll on a soldier's morale. When they returned to the United States, some soldiers were treated badly by the people who opposed the war. They were insulted or even spit on. The people of the U.S. are blaming these men for something that they didn't have a choice in. They were drafted, they were forced to go, and yet they were seen as the bad guys. So if you look up at the top, you want to summarize one of the factors that affected the morale of the U.S. troops during Vietnam. So you either want to look at stress, the draft, or the home front, and explain how that affected the morale. And then, for you, which factor do you think would have been the hardest to cope with? Would you have been having problems because of the stress? Would you be having problems because you were forced into the military and you didn't want to be? Or would you be sad about the way people felt about you at home? The enemy all around. Guerrilla warfare, the inhospitable climate and terrain, and political problems combined to make Vietnam a uniquely different war to fight. As Warren Wooten, an American soldier who served in Vietnam, said, "It seemed like the whole country was the enemy. The animals, the reptiles, the insects, the plants, and the people." First person. Writer Tim O'Brien based Charming Billy on his own experiences as an infantryman in Vietnam. Of the constant terror of the soldier, he has said, "It's not easy to fight this sort of self-defeating fear, but you try. You decide to be ultra careful, the hard-nosed, realistic approach. You try to second-guess the mind. Should you put your foot on that flat rock or on the clump of weeds to its rear? Patty Dyke wall or water? You wish you were Tarzan, able to swing in the vines. You trace the footsteps of the men to your front. You give up when he curses you for following too closely. Better one man dead than two." So, what factors made the war difficult for the U.S. soldiers, and which factor does O'Brien describe in this excerpt? Please answer that question. When you go on to Google Classroom, there will be a quiz. There is no writing for this piece, and the next lesson will be on the next two pieces. Stay safe, wash your hands.